With the huge range of shooters that released for the PlayStation, it was easy for games to get lost in the shuffle, and one of them is Airra. It's a vertical shooter, and your objective is to take out the forces of an army hell-bent on world domination, and while the premise is your pretty standard setup, it's the gameplay that really helps Airra shine. At the beginning, you get to choose from one of 4 different pilots that come along with their own unique ships that possess their own attributes. You've got the all-rounder, one with better attack and defense but moves at a slower pace, as well as an agile ship, and finally one that excels at bombing targets on the ground. This selection allows you to choose one that suits your approach to shooters, and as you would guess, it means you've got to deal with targets all around you, may that be in the air or trailing across the ground, and thankfully you've got a decent selection of weapons to help get the job done. Each of the ships possess a basic cannon, and as you shoot it, you'll automatically drop bombs, but should you hold the shooting button, you'll be able to manually lock on to the targets and fire off against multiple enemies at a time. The lock-on has a tendency to feel a bit slow, but after some time with the game it becomes a bit easier to use, and it's a good idea to do so, as you'll be able to net a huge amount of bonus points by taking out specific ground targets. Complementing the selection of weapons is the power-up system, and as you destroy your enemies you'll slowly build up a meter for your overdrive ability that lets you shoot far more bullets at once, and it's perfect for those moments when it becomes nigh on impossible to stay on top of the relentless amount of enemies. Although Airra is nowhere near the best shooter on the PlayStation, it's still a solid effort, and for anyone who's fond of similar experiences, it's more than worth tracking down and trying out for yourself. 2D fighters were pretty common on the PlayStation, from well-known hits like the Street Fighter series and Darkstalkers to underrated gems like Gundam Battle Assault, and with so many games hitting the console, it was inevitable that some would fly well under the radar. One of these is Don't Lose, which is a sequel to the Super Nintendo game Kendo Rage, and it's a bit strange though, as the first game was a sort of action platformer with the sequel not even featuring the main character, but it ends up being a pretty decent experience. As you would guess, you get a selection of several fighters that all share the basic string of punches and kicks that can be linked together to form combos, as well as a range of special moves that are unique to each character. What makes it a bit different from the usual fighting games of its time though are the subtle RPG elements that are baked into the gameplay. As you make your way through each fight, you'll begin to level up and slowly gain access to different moves as you reach the higher levels. To be fair, it's nothing exactly groundbreaking, but something that ends up being an interesting inclusion. What stood out to me though is the sheer amount of personality and charm that the game possesses. From having to fight larger-than-life robots to zombies and football players, it's clearly a game that's not afraid to have a bit of fun, and this translates to the gameplay itself that's easy to pick up and play, and relies on the standard low to high attacks, and as you both deal and take damage, you'll slowly build what is known as the Makendo meter that once full allows you to pull off various super attacks that can flip the odds in your favour should you find yourself in a rough spot. Although it's nothing that you wouldn't have seen before, if you're a fan of 2D fighters and are looking for a new PlayStation game to give a try, then Don't Lose is a great choice, especially if you want something that doesn't take itself too serious and is instead focused on simply having a good time with plenty of humour but enough depth in its mechanics to make it compelling for serious players. Fireman 2 is the sequel to an often overlooked but completely different type of action game that released on the Super Nintendo. What made it unique was that it put you into the boots of a firefighter, where your only obstacles are the roaring flames that engulf the buildings of each mission, and it's down to you to extinguish all of the fires and save as many survivors as you can. As its name suggests, it all focuses on Danny and Pete, and takes place in New York on Christmas Eve, and although the premise makes it sound simple, there's a lot more to it than just simply squirting water. Pete is equipped with a hose and an unlimited amount of water, with there being different types of flames to put out, from towering infernos to small embers on the floor, and you're able to switch between 2 different types of spraying. First is the more direct beam of water that's perfect for taking on bigger flames, but you can also switch to a sort of spread shot that covers more ground and makes the larger areas that are on fire far easier to deal with. Danny, on the other hand, instead of having a hose, comes along with an axe that shoots out waves of water at the flames, and both of them also have access to a water bomb, which really comes in handy during some of the more challenging levels. What makes it so much fun to play though is the sheer variety of locations that you'll find yourself going to, from apartments to shopping malls and museums that add a great amount of creativity to the game, the best being the boss fights at the end of most of the missions, such as having to fight a dinosaur or trying to extinguish flames that have a mind of their own. Making it even better is the 2-player mode, which allows you and a friend to control Danny and Pete and take on the main missions together. other, and to be honest, this is the best way to play it. So if you and a buddy are up to saving the streets of New York, this is definitely one of the better multiplayer games on the PlayStation to give a go. Love and Destroy is a third-person shooter that's set well into the future, where the Earth has begun to be invaded by an alien force, and in order to save the planet, a scientist creates 3 powerful mechs which is sent back in time to cut off the invasion when it first began. This is where the player comes in and gets to jump into one of these robots and hopefully stamp out the alien threat before it even gets a chance to spread. Now the game is largely split up into 2 different styles of play, with the most prominent being the 3D shooting sections, but each mech comes along with a female navigator, and when you're not fighting you get to form bonds with the 3 different women, and depending on your choices and use of each mech throughout the game, your relationship will either grow or falter. For the shooting missions, you're tasked with taking out either a single large entity or a group of smaller enemies, and you've got a pretty strict time limit of 5 minutes to get it done. What makes it quite impressive is that the battles take place in huge arenas inside the city, and the environments are completely destructible, which gives way to a huge amount of chaos during each fight. Before tackling a mission, you get to choose from the 3 different mechs, and while they all share a basic canon, they each have their own attributes and abilities that make them different. One moves at a far higher speed but can only use weak short-ranged melee attacks, whereas the other is a lot slower but grants you the use of long-range weapons that pack a serious punch. And finally, with the third one, you get the best of both worlds that balances speed with an equal amount of damage. If you perform well and create a connection with each mech's navigator, you'll begin to unlock upgrades for your mech, but with all of the game being in Japanese, you'll have to follow a guide that's easily available online. So if you're up for the hectic nature of the gameplay and are ready for a steep challenge, Love and Destroy more than deserves a playthrough. Galaxy Fight is a 2D fighter that originally appeared in the arcades but eventually found its way to the PlayStation, and much like its name suggests, it saw you fighting throughout the galaxy, as you got the choice of 8 different characters that all bring their own unique flavour to the table. While on the surface it may seem like it's a pretty simple fighting game, with it only utilising a 3-button setup, one for a low, medium and high attack respectively, it does manage to innovate in different areas that give it a surprising amount of depth. The first and most obvious is that each of the fighting stages have no corners, which opens up the playing field and gives rise to one of the best mechanics in the game, and that's the dashing. These dash attacks not only add range to your simple moves and jumps, but also higher amounts of damage should you connect, so it's encouraged to use the entire space, which often results in some rather chaotic fights. Apart from your simple moves, one aspect of the game that really helps the competitive nature of its shine is the ability to counter. Should you find yourself completely stunned by blocking, it's really easy to catch your opponent off guard and hit back with a special move, and this aspect alone helps keep the flow of each fight feeling fast and responsive. Coupling this with the size of each arena, and it ends up being a really fast-paced ordeal that's easy to lose track of if you don't know what you're doing, so it's a good idea to get to grips with one of the 8 different characters and settle in with one that suits your style. One of the first things you'll notice about the game though are the visuals, especially how the character palettes change to reflect the different lighting conditions of the level, or the watery surfaces that look convincingly wet thanks to some excellent reflections and shimmering effects, and of course the parallax scrolling that's used to give a real sense of depth and speed to each stage you fight on. It ends up being a really compelling 2D fighter, and while it may not have been the most innovative for its time, it feels like it's got an identity that it can firmly call its own. Tamsoft were a company that were well known for their budget releases, with them bringing many different types of games to market to varying degrees of success. One game that really hit the ground running though was Abalaburn, that was both a 3D fighter as well as an action adventure, and ended up being one of the more creative games to come out of the company. There's not much in terms of story, with it basically revolving around 8 different fighters as they try to find various shards of a crystal in the hopes of resurrecting an ancient being who's said to be able to grant wishes. As I mentioned, the game is split up into 2 main modes, with the arcade mode providing a pretty traditional 3D fighting setup where you've got to make your way through different stages and reach the boss, but where Abalaburn is at its best is with its adventure mode that takes the game in a completely different direction. Your goal here is to make it through 8 different areas that each house a shard of the crystal you need to complete, but occupying each of these spaces are a range of different monsters that you've got to fight in real time by using a scaled back version of your character's moveset from the main fighting mode. If you've ever played Mega Man Legends, the controls will feel instantly familiar, with it being a tank setup and the shoulder buttons controlling which direction you face. It can take a bit of time to get used to it, but once it clicks it's easy to navigate the world. And on top of this, there's plenty of platforming challenges to contend with, as well as a few puzzles that see you in keys in order to advance to the next stage. But whilst exploring, you'll come into contact with bosses, and here it quickly shifts back to a 3D fighter. The way it seamlessly blends the two different genres was completely unique for its time, and while it may not offer the deepest systems when it comes to the fighting itself, the adventure mode alone is well worth playing it for. Kileak received a pretty bad reception upon its release, but I could never figure out why, as although it was pretty basic compared to its competition, it was still a solid shooter that had a fair few of its own ideas. The story follows Matt Coder as you're sent into a facility to stop a scientist from performing horrific genetic experiments that have resulted in his grotesque creations running amok around the compound. In order to protect yourself from the threat they pose, you're given a special armored suit that comes along with various weapons that run off its battery. This aspect adds a serious amount of management to your actions, as although it's possible to find battery packs throughout each of the levels of the facility, they are few and far between, so you've got to carefully choose your shots in order not to run out of ammo, and end up finding yourself vulnerable to the many different types of enemies that roam the corridors. And not only are your weapons tied to the amount of energy you currently have, but so is your shield, and to make matters worse, there's several boss encounters that can't be avoided, unlike the usual enemies, so it's imperative to keep on top of your energy. A lot of the criticism that the game received was aimed at its rather dull level design, and it's clear to see that it was a valid complaint, but for an early 3D shooter I found it quite enjoyable to play through, especially with the management of your suit that helps to ramp up the tension of navigating the tight albeit repetitive hallways. It won't be for everyone, but if you've got a tendency to enjoy the earlier 3D games for the PlayStation, this one is a bit of an oddity that's well worth firing up. Novastorm is an on-rail shooter that takes place far into the future where aliens have begun to threaten the Earth and are all but trying to take it for themselves. As the player, you jump into a ship as part of the scavenger squad and take to the skies to help destroy the enemy forces. As with many games of its kind, the story takes a backseat to the gameplay, which all takes place from behind the perspective of your ship, where you're free to move across the screen at will. As you would expect, you've got an arsenal of weapons to help counter the alien threat, with the most basic being your cannon that fires towards the center of the screen, and at first it can be a bit strange not being able to control the direction of your shots, but it soon becomes apparent that you've got to wait and line them up to be effective. Complementing your cannon are a number of smart bombs that can destroy all of the enemies on screen, as well as all of their shots, should you find it all getting a bit too much to handle. Now, taking out as many enemies as you can is essential to advancing through the game, as aside from simply adding points to your score, destroying all of the enemies in any given wave will net you either a bronze, silver or gold coin, which can then be spent on various upgrades for your ship, such as extra shots for your cannon, more powerful shots, extra smart bombs, or drones to aid you in the fight. What helps set Novastorm apart from others though is its reliance on full motion video during gameplay that holds up surprisingly well. Each of the game's levels, and specifically boss encounters, are presented with this in mind and look incredible in motion, and must have been mind-blowing upon its release back in the day. It ends up feeling like a long playable cutscene, which really adds to the overall cinematic feel of the gameplay and makes it truly unique amongst the various shooters that released for the PlayStation. Although it can be quite challenging and a bit tough to get used to at first, Novastorm is more than deserving of a spot in any PlayStation fan's collection. Mad Stalker is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that throws you into the role of a mech pilot as you're tasked with stopping an army of evil robots set on destroying one of the last remaining cities after a huge war. To be fair, there's not much in terms of a plot, but for what it lacks in story, Mad Stalker more than makes up for in gameplay. It ends up being a bit different to the other beat-em-ups on the PlayStation, and it keeps all of the action on one plane, with the combat resembling a 2D fighter. Despite the sheer size and weight of your mech, it's pretty easy to get around and you're agile enough to counter the waves of enemies that come your way with both a handy dash and double jump. Where the similarities with fighting games come into play is how you have to attack your targets. Whereas most beat-em-ups just rely on hitting the same button to form combos, here with Mad Stalker you've actually got to build your attacks, going from low to medium and then finishing them off with a more powerful technique that can knock them flying into the air. There's also plenty of special moves to get to grips with, from rising slashes of your sword to huge blasts of your gun that make short work of the enemies. Because of this, it's it's not just a mindless experience where you've got to simply mash to win, and rather a lot more skill is involved in reaching the end of each stage. My favourite aspect of the game though were the visuals, that make great use of sprite work and well drawn backgrounds that keep each and every second of the gameplay engaging. Watching your mech perform one of its many special moves and see sparks, flames and explosions light up the screen really adds to the overall action, and more importantly it gives a decisive weight to each of your attacks. Ultimately, Mad Stalker ended up becoming one of my favourite beat 'em ups on the PlayStation, and sure, it's not without its faults, but for anyone with fond memories of Final Fight or Streets of Rage, there's plenty here to enjoy. The PlayStation was no stranger to adaptations of many different manga series, and although they weren't always the best in terms of quality, now and again one would thoroughly impress. One game that hit all of the right marks was Gundam Martian Memory, which is based on Battle Angel Alita and came in the form of an action RPG. After being found disembodied by a scientist who puts you back together, you control Alita as you try to unlock your lost memories in a world where bounty hunting is the main way to prove yourself and earn currency. Thankfully, Presto created a pretty efficient fighting system for all of the action to play out in, where you're free to take advantage of the various skills your berserker body grants you. Now there's only 3 buttons you've got to worry about, 2 offering different types of attacks and the 3rd allowing you to block, but by holding down R1 it's possible to pull off more powerful versions of your regular attacks, and as you progress throughout the game and unlock new upgrades for your body, you'll gain access to powerful super combos that can really devastate your opponent in a flash. You've also got a wealth of defensive maneuvers as well, such as rolling and backflipping out of harm's way and being able to counter incoming attacks by blocking at the right time. That being said, combat is entirely optional and it's possible to simply slip by the enemy without having to engage them, where you've got to physically press the select button in order to enter each fight when you're close. Of course, it wouldn't be Battle Angel Alita without Motorball, and it's great to see it's also included in the game, which ends up being a sort of mashup of racing and combat at the same time that offers a welcome break from exploring and fighting within the world. Ultimately, Martian Memory is one hell of a game, and for any fan of the series, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for the next one, which will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos that release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skilljim, Shuden, Aphinium Mind, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining the Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check the video out. I'll catch you next time.